The day Alberta Rourke rode into Harlow Creek, she arrived with a rifle across her saddle, a bruise yellowing along her jaw, and the kind of eyes that dared anyone to ask about either one. It was the spring of 1882, and the Wyoming Territory was no place for softness. The land itself had made that fact abundantly clear over the decades. The winters that buried cattle to their necks, the summers that cracked the earth like old porcelain, the men who came west dreaming of fortune and left broken, or did not leave at all. The town of Harlow Creek had been carved out of the high plains with sheer stubbornness, a collection of timber buildings and hard-won dreams sitting at the edge of a valley that stretched so wide and golden it could make a person weep if they were inclined toward weeping. Alberta Rourke was not inclined toward weeping. She had tried it once, a long time ago, and it had accomplished precisely nothing. She dismounted her roan mare, a rangy, ill-tempered animal she called Dust, at the post in front of Harlow Creek's general store. She was 26 years old, tall for a woman, with dark auburn hair that she kept braided and tucked under a wide-brimmed hat, and a face that the women of the town would later describe as handsome, which was the word they used when a woman looked like she could handle whatever came at her. Her hands were calloused. Her boots were worn. She had $2.40 in her coat pocket, and the deed to 40 acres of scrubland 7 miles northeast of town, a piece of property her father had died owing taxes on, and which she had spent the last 3 months working at a laundry in Cheyenne to reclaim. She tied Dust to the post with a deliberate knot and pushed through the door of the general store without hesitation. The man behind the counter was round-faced and wore spectacles that had been mended with wire on one side. He looked up from his ledger and blinked. It was not every day that a woman walked in alone, unflinching, with trail dust on her coat and nothing apologetic about her posture. "I need 20 pounds of flour, 10 of cornmeal, a pound of salt, some nails, a box of cartridges for a Winchester, and a length of rope," Alberta said. "I would also like to know who holds water rights on the North Fork of Harlow Creek that runs through Section 9. The storekeeper, whose name was Albert Crane, set his pen down. "That be Nathan Keating," he said. "He owns the land to the east of Section 9, got the Keating Ranch, been there since his father's time." "Is he reasonable?" Alberta asked. Albert Crane considered the question for a moment longer than was comfortable. "He is quiet," he said finally. "Quiet and fair, far as most folks know." "Quiet and fair will do," Alberta said, and began laying out the money she had for what she could afford. She could not afford everything on her list. She took the flour, the salt, the cornmeal, and the cartridges, and decided the nails and the rope would wait until she had assessed the property. She loaded the supplies into the saddlebags herself, ignoring the 2 men on the bench outside the store who watched her with the particular brand of idle curiosity that men in small towns applied to anything they could not immediately categorize. One of them, a florid man with a vest that strained at its buttons, spoke up as she was finishing. "That ain't easy country out there, Section 9, he said. "Lived out there before, did you?" "I grew up on it," Alberta said without looking at him. "Thought old Rourke's girl went east," the other man said. "She came back," Alberta replied, and swung up onto Dust with one smooth movement and rode. The 40 acres looked worse than she remembered. She had not been back since her father's funeral 2 years ago, and before that, not since she was 18, when her mother had died and she had gone with her aunt to Cheyenne because there was nothing left to hold her here and nothing left to hold her anywhere, and she had learned quickly that a young woman with no money and no family connections had better learn to work hard and ask nothing from anybody, because nothing was precisely what she would receive otherwise. The house still stood. Barely. The roof on the southern side had caved inward over what had been the main sleeping room, and the front porch had lost 2 of its supporting posts, so it leaned like a man falling asleep standing up. The barn was in better shape, which was a mercy, because Dust needed shelter more immediately than Alberta did. She spent the first afternoon making the barn safe, patching gaps in the walls with boards she pried from the collapsed porch section, clearing out a decade of accumulated debris, checking the well behind the structure, and finding the water still clean, which was the first genuinely good thing that had happened to her in longer than she wanted to reckon. She slept in the barn that first night wrapped in her bedroll, the horses breathing warm and steady nearby, and looked at the ceiling beams and thought about what was possible. The land was dry but not ruined. The soil in the lower field was still deep and dark, and she could see where her father had worked it, the furrows weathered but real. The north fence needed complete rebuilding. She had no cattle, no chickens, no seed beyond what the soil itself might remember. She had 40 acres, a rifle, a horse, and the specific kind of stubborn that her father had called useful, and every man who had tried to court her had eventually called impossible. She had heard it put differently over the years, too fierce. That was the word that had followed her like a faithful dog ever since she was a girl, ever since she had argued with her schoolteacher over the classification of a mathematical error and been proven right, ever since she had told the first young man who tried to put his arm around her uninvited exactly what she thought of that. Ever since she had run a laundry crew in Cheyenne with the calm efficiency of a general moving troops, and none of the men who worked the surrounding businesses had known quite what to do with that. Too fierce to court, too fierce to keep. Too fierce, the women whispered, to love, as if fierceness and love were mutually exclusive, as if the land itself was not fierce, as if everything worth keeping in this part of the world had not been won by people who refused to be anything less than fierce. She thought about all of that in the dark of the barn, and then she stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it had never yet built a fence or cleared a field, and dawn was coming, and she had work to do. On her third day on the property, she rode out to trace the North Fork of Harlow Creek, which ran through the northeast corner of her land before it cut through a narrow, rocky passage and disappeared onto the Keating property. The water was low but flowing, cold and clean from the mountains that were visible as blue shapes on the northern horizon. She knelt beside it and drank from her cupped hands and sat back on her heels and tried to calculate how much of her irrigation problem this solved and how much it didn't, and she was still working through the numbers in her head when she heard hoofbeats. The man who rode up on a gray horse was not what she had expected from Elbert Crane's description of quiet and fair. She had pictured someone older, perhaps thicker, the kind of man who had simply stopped fighting and called it peace. Nathan Keating was 31 years old and lean in the way that years of outdoor work made a person lean, like wood that had been smoothed by weather into something stronger than its original form. He had dark hair going a little long at the collar and a jaw that was clean-shaved, which was unusual enough out here that she noticed it. He had gray eyes, the exact color of the horse he was riding, and he looked at her from beneath the brim of a plain dark hat with an expression that was not unfriendly but was not assuming either. He stopped his horse at a respectful distance. "You would be Alberta Rourke," he said. His voice was steady and low. "I would be," she said, standing and brushing the dirt from her knees. She did not offer her hand because she wanted to see what he would do, and what he did was tip his hat slightly and stay where he was. "I heard you were back. Elbert told me someone had paid the taxes on the Rourke property. I wanted to come introduce myself." He paused. "I'm Nathan Keating." "I know," she said. "I was going to come find you this week about the water rights." Something shifted in his face, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration. "All right," he said. "What about them?" "I need to know if you have any formal claim on the section of the North Fork that crosses my land, or if your grandfather's original rights extend only to the portion downstream." He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of a man who didn't know the answer. It was the quiet of a man who was deciding how to approach a conversation that had started several steps ahead of where he had anticipated. "The rights your father registered in 1868 covered the stretch from the property line east to the stone outcropping near the old cottonwood," he said. My water rights begin downstream of that. I have never drawn from the section on your land." "Good," she said. "That simplifies things." "Does it?" he said, and it was not quite a question. "It means I don't have to fight you for it." He looked at her for another moment, and she had the distinct impression he was not accustomed to being spoken to this directly, and that he did not entirely dislike it. "Were you planning to?" he asked. "Only if necessary," she said. "I prefer not to fight if there are other options. But I've found other options usually require being clear about your willingness to fight. Otherwise people assume you'll accommodate them and take liberties." Nathan Keating looked out over the creek for a moment, and when he looked back at her there was something in his gray eyes that she could not precisely name, but that felt obscurely like recognition. "Your land needs work," he said. It was not unkind. "I know what my land needs," she said. "What it needs is time and labor, both of which I have, and fencing material and seed stock, and probably at least one other pair of hands. Eventually," she said. "Right now, what I have will do." He nodded slowly. "If you need anything from Keating Ranch, you are welcome to ask," he said. "We have tools you might borrow. And I'm sending my man Hector into town on Saturday. I can have him bring back anything you need from Albert's if you make a list." She looked at him for a beat. It was a practical offer, stated practically. There was no condescension in it, no implication that she needed rescuing, just the straightforward acknowledgement that they were neighbors and neighbors sometimes helped each other. She had not expected that, and she did not let the fact that she had not expected it show on her face. "I appreciate that," she said. "I may take you up on the tools." He nodded again, touched the brim of his hat, and turned his horse. He had ridden about 30 feet when she called after him. "Mr. Keating." He turned in the saddle. "Thank you for coming in person. Some men would have sent a hired hand." He seemed to think about that for a moment. "Some men would have," he agreed. And then he rode on, and she watched him go until the gray horse and its rider became small against the wide flat gold of the high plain, and then she turned back to the creek and went on calculating. Over the following 3 weeks, Alberta worked herself to the edge of what one person could reasonably accomplish alone. She repaired the roof of the house using timber she salvaged from an old lean-to at the back of the property. And when she ran out of timber, she rode to the Keating Ranch and asked to borrow tools, as she had said she might. Nathan was not there when she arrived, his hand Hector, a compact Mexican man with silver in his hair and a cheerful practicality about him, showed her to the tool shed and helped her load what she needed into her saddlebags and rigged a small cart to dust so she could haul the heavier items. When Nathan came in from the east field an hour later and found Alberta Rourke in his tool shed carefully inspecting the edge of a drawknife, he stopped in the doorway. "Good afternoon," she said without looking up from the blade. "Afternoon," he said. "Find everything you needed." Hector was helpful. She set the drawknife back and picked up a handsaw. "This is a good one, Cleveland make. My father bought it in '71, he said. "Still cuts clean. Your father had good taste in tools." "He had good taste in most things," Nathan said, and there was a quiet weight to the words that made her look up. His father had been dead 5 years. She had learned that from Albert Crane on her second trip to town, along with the fact that Nathan had been running the ranch alone since then. Alone in the way that meant without family, not without hands. He had 3 men working for him. Hector, a young cowboy called Ray Dokes who was barely 20 and still learning how to be in the world, and an older hand named Willard Patch who had worked the Keating land since Nathan was a boy. The ranch ran 200 head of cattle and had a reputation for sound management and fair treatment of its workers, which in 1882 in Wyoming was not as common as one might hope. "I'll have these back to you inside of a week," she said, gesturing at the saw and a set of chisels she had selected. "Take what time you need," he said. He leaned against the doorframe in a way that was not quite casual, watching her. "How's the house coming?" "The north roof is nearly done. I'm working on the floor joists next. 2 of them have rotted through. Do you have enough timber? I will if I'm careful about how I cut it." He was quiet for a moment. "I have some seasoned pine lumber in the far barn," he said. We milled it last fall for a fence project that ended up not needing as much as we planned. You could take what you need." She looked at him directly. "That is a generous offer." "It's practical," he said. "Lumber sitting in a barn doesn't help anybody, and a neighbor with a solid floor is a better neighbor than one falling through it." There was a faint uptick at the corner of his mouth when he said the last part, barely enough to call a smile, but she caught it, and something in her chest did a thing she did not immediately have a name for. She made herself look back at the tools. "I'll take 10 feet," she said. "I'll pay you when I have the money." "That's fine," he said. "No hurry," she nodded. She loaded the cart. She drove dust back across the 7 miles to her property, with the tools clanking softly, and the afternoon sun laying itself in long golden bars across the plain. And she thought about gray eyes and wood sitting unused in a far barn, and the specific quality of a man who offered things without drama. And she pushed all of that thought down flat and thought instead about floor joists. Because floor joists were something she understood completely, and the other thing was still uncertain territory. April turned to May. The high plain burst into color, the kind of extravagant, short-lived blooming that the Wyoming spring managed once a year before the heat of summer descended. Wildflowers running riot through the grasses, the creek running higher with snowmelt from the northern mountains. Alberta planted her kitchen garden in the deep soil along the south side of the house and put in a small field of wheat in the lower 40. And she began to understand the rhythm of the land again, the way she had understood it as a girl, the way it had been taken from her when she had been taken from it. She encountered Nathan Keating perhaps once a week during this time, usually by accident along the boundary fence line or at the creek, occasionally on the road into Harlow Creek. Their conversations were short and direct, and she found herself, without particularly intending to, looking forward to them. He asked good questions. He listened to the answers. When he offered information, it was always relevant and never condescending. He had a habit of looking at the land when he spoke, not at her, which she initially took as disinterest and gradually came to understand was the opposite. That looking away was his way of making a conversation feel less like an examination, giving her room to speak without the pressure of being watched. One afternoon in late May, she was working on the north fence when a calf, small, leggy, clearly confused about how it had ended up on the wrong side of the wire, trotted up to her, and looked at her with the trusting blankness that young cattle brought to all situations. She put down her wire stretcher and caught the calf by the scruff of its neck, which it did not resist, and turned it around and nudged it back through the gap in the fence she was repairing. As she watched it trot off toward the Keating cattle on the eastern field, she heard hoofbeats and turned to find Nathan riding toward her from the direction of his herd. "That is yours, I believe," she said, gesturing after the calf. He looked at it, then back at her. "Howdini," he said. "Hector named him. He gets out twice a week. You should tell Hector to name the next one something less aspirational," she said. This time Nathan Keating actually smiled. It was a complete smile, not just the fractional uptick she had seen before, and it changed his face in a way that was startling, not because it made him suddenly handsome, which he was already, but because it made him suddenly accessible like a window opening in a stone wall. He caught himself and the smile faded, but it had been real and they both knew it. "I'll pass along the suggestion," he said. "Thank you for catching him." "He came to me willingly," she said. "I can't claim much credit." "You would be surprised how many people wouldn't have bothered," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I need good relations with my neighbors," she said. "And besides, he's a good calf. It would be a shame to lose him to the road." There was a pause. The wind came through the grass and the calf had already rejoined the herd and was being regarded with maternal exasperation by what was presumably its mother. Nathan's gray horse shifted its weight. "Miss Rourke," he said, "I wonder if you would be willing to come to supper on Saturday evening. Hector cooks, and he is considerably better at it than I am, and we generally have room at the table for a guest." She looked at him carefully. She had been invited to supper by men before, and it had generally meant one of two things, neither of which had interested her. But there was nothing in Nathan Keating's face that suggested anything other than what the words said. A neighbor inviting a neighbor to supper. "All right," she said. "Saturday." He nodded, touched his hat, and rode off without fuss, and she turned back to the fence and was 3 posts along before she realized she was humming, which she stopped doing immediately because there was no call for that. Hector cooked venison stew and cornbread, and a dried apple pie that was better than anything Alberta had eaten since her mother's kitchen. And the table at the Keating Ranch was nothing special, plain pine, 4 chairs, a lamp that smoked a little. But the meal was one of the most comfortable she could remember. Ray Dokes ate with his hat off and his ears red, visibly uncertain how to behave around a woman who spoke directly to him and expected direct answers in return. Willard Patch had the easy manners of a man who had simply seen enough of life to be comfortable in most situations. Hector told a story about a bull that had once chased him up a water tower in Laramie and managed to make it both funny and terrifying. Nathan ate quietly and listened and asked occasional questions, and once, when Alberta said something that made the whole table laugh, she caught him watching her with that look again, the one she could not quite name, and this time he did not look away immediately. Neither did she. And then Hector refilled everyone's coffee, and the moment passed like weather, but it left something behind. Walking back to her horse after the meal, Nathan walked with her. The night was enormous around them, the sky so full of stars it looked generous, the air carrying the dry, sweet smell of sage and grass. They walked without speaking for a moment, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. "You haven't asked me," she said. "Asked you what?" he said. "What everyone in town asks. Why I came back. Why I didn't stay in Cheyenne. Whether a woman alone can really manage 40 acres. She looked at him sideways. Whether I've had offers from reasonable men who would make things easier." He was quiet. "I imagine you have had plenty of offers," he said carefully. "And I imagine you have your reasons for all the choices you've made. Neither of those things is my business." "Most people disagree," she said. "Most people spend a great deal of energy on other people's business," he said. "It seems like wasted effort when there is so much of your own to attend to." She stopped at Dust's side and turned to face him. The lantern light from the barn reached this far and lit the planes of his face softly. He was not a man who used many words, she had established that, but every word he used was load-bearing. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know exactly," she admitted. "Something easier to categorize." He seemed to consider this. "You are not what I expected either," he said. "What did you expect?" He was quiet for a beat that was just long enough to be deliberate. "I don't think I was expecting anything," he said. "But whatever I was expecting, it wasn't this." She did not ask him what this was, and he did not volunteer it. She mounted Dust and rode home under the enormous sky and thought about it anyway, and decided it was probably the same thing she had not named yet either, and that naming it could wait. June came and brought with it the first real heat of summer, and with the heat came trouble. It arrived in the form of a man named Colfax Marden, who rode into Harlow Creek one Tuesday morning, with 3 men behind him, and a piece of paper that he claimed gave him grazing rights to the water access on Section 9. Colfax Marden was a land speculator out of Denver who had spent the previous 2 years acquiring grazing rights and water access claims across 3 Wyoming counties by any means available, which included legitimate purchase, creative legal interpretation, and outright intimidation, and he had not yet been stopped because no one in his path had been willing or able to stop him. Alberta heard about it from Elbert Crane when she came in for supplies on Friday. Marden had filed the claim at the county seat in Lander, and it referenced water rights that had supposedly lapsed when her father's taxes went unpaid. Elbert told her this with the manner of a man delivering bad news that he wished he did not have to deliver. "The county recorder's name is Jasper Holt," Elbert said carefully. "He and Marden have been known to find each other agreeable." Alberta put both hands flat on the counter. "I have the original deed," she said. "And I have the tax payment receipt from February." "That should be enough," Elbert said, "provided the case is heard honestly. The provided sat in the air like smoke. She rode out of town with her jaw set and her mind working through the problem with the same methodical intensity she applied to rotted floor joists and broken fence lines. She was halfway home when she encountered Nathan on the road. He was coming from town himself, and he could read something in her posture before she said a word. "What's happened?" he said. She told him, tersely and completely. He listened without interrupting, his gray eyes level and attentive. "Marden," he said when she had finished. "I know his name. He tried something similar with a homesteader named Caldwell over near Riverton last year. Caldwell didn't have the paperwork to fight it." "I have the paperwork," she said. "Then we need to make sure it gets in front of someone who isn't Jasper Holt," Nathan said. "There is a federal land commissioner who comes through Lander quarterly. His name is Elias Drummond, and he is not bought. His next visit is 6 weeks out." "6 weeks is a long time," she said. "In the meantime," Nathan said, "Marden will likely try to establish presence on the water access. He'll send men to occupy the land." He paused. "You should not be dealing with that alone." "I have a rifle," she said. "I know you do," he said, and there was no hint of dismissal in it. "And I have 3 men and 2 more rifles, and my water rights are downstream of yours, which means if Marden gets your access, he will eventually come for mine too. This is not charity, Miss Rourke. This is common interest." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon sun was heavy and the road was dusty, and the problem was real and his logic was sound, and there was something else underneath all of it that neither of them was addressing, but the logic was sound. "All right," she said. Over the next 2 weeks, things on the boundary of Section 9 grew tense in the way that the high plains grew tense, quietly, persistently, with an undertone of violence that never quite surfaced but never entirely went away either. Marden's men appeared 3 times at the North Fork crossing. Twice, Alberta was there first and held her ground with a calm that clearly unnerved them. The 3rd time, Nathan was with her, and Hector was 20 yards up the slope, and the Marden men looked at the 4 of them and decided against whatever they had been planning and rode back east. After the 3rd encounter, Nathan and Alberta sat on the bank of the creek while the horses drank and Hector rode a perimeter check. The sun was going west and the creek was catching the light and making it into something moving and gold and beautiful. "They will not stop on their own," Alberta said. "They will wait for a moment when we are less prepared." "I know," Nathan said, "which is why I have written to Commissioner Drummond requesting an early visit. I may be able to move his schedule." She looked at him. That is a significant favor to ask." "I know Drummond from my father's dealings with the land office," Nathan said. "He was honest then. I believe he still is." He paused. "And your case is legitimate. It deserves a legitimate hearing." Something shifted in her chest. It was the same thing that had shifted on the night of supper, the unnamed thing, but it was larger now and more insistent, and she was running out of room to put it aside. She looked out at the creek. "Nathan," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. She felt him become very still beside her. "Yes," he said. "Why are you doing this?" The question sat between them. A bird called from somewhere upstream. The horses lifted their heads and water ran off their muzzles in bright threads. "Because it's right," he said. It was a simple answer, and she believed it entirely. But she waited because she had learned he sometimes had more. "And because," he said more carefully, "I find that I have been thinking about what happens to this land if things go wrong for you, and I find that I cannot think about it without—" He stopped. He looked at the creek. "I should not say more than that right now." "Why not?" she said quietly. He was very quiet for a moment. "Because I don't know what you would do with it," he said at last, "and I don't want to make things complicated when they are already complicated enough." She could have left it there. She was good at leaving things where they lay. But she had also spent the last 2 months noticing the way he listened, and the way he moved through the world without demanding that it arrange itself around him, and the way he had said fierce is what this land requires on the evening of the supper when Willard Patch had told a story about a neighbor who had called her difficult, and Nathan had said it with the calm certainty of a man stating a fact about the weather. He had said it when he thought she wasn't listening, and she had been listening to every word. "It would not make things complicated," she said. "Not the kind of complicated you mean." He turned to look at her. In the western light, his eyes were more silver than gray, and she held his gaze and let him read whatever was there to read in her face, which was more than she usually allowed anyone. "Alberta," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded different than it did anywhere else. Not softer, she did not need softness, but more deliberately spoken, like something being handled with care. "I am not easy," she said. "I know that. I have been told that my entire life, and I have stopped apologizing for it." "I know you have," he said. "I am not asking you to." "I am also," she said, and her voice was very steady, "not too fierce to love, whatever anyone has said about that." He looked at her with that look she had never been able to name, and now, sitting beside the creek in the last of the day's light, she understood finally what it was. It was attention. Pure, uncomplicated, complete attention. He was not looking at what she was not. He was looking at what she was, and he had been doing it since the first afternoon by the creek when she had told him she preferred not to fight if there were other options, and he had looked at her the same way then, and she had not recognized it yet. "No," he said quietly, "you are not." He did not say anything else. He did not need to. They sat beside the creek until the light failed and Hector came back, and the three of them rode back to their respective properties in the warm dark. And Alberta lay in her repaired house on the solid floor. She had rebuilt herself and looked at the ceiling and thought that something had begun, and that it frightened her less than she had always assumed it would. Commissioner Elias Drummond arrived in Lander 10 days ahead of his scheduled visit, which was a testament either to Nathan's persuasiveness or to the commissioner's own sense of professional integrity, which turned out to be considerable. He was a compact, white-haired man with the manner of someone who had heard every variety of land claim dispute that the American West could produce, and had developed both the patience and the precision to cut through them. He reviewed Alberta's documents in the county office in Lander, while Colfax Marden sat on the other side of the table with his lawyer, and the air of a man who was accustomed to these proceedings going his way. They did not go his way. Commissioner Drummond laid out the timeline of Alberta's father's original registration, the tax delinquency, the redemption window provided under Wyoming territorial law, and Alberta's payment of the back taxes within that window with the clarity of a man reading scripture. Marden's claim, which relied on the false assertion that the redemption window had closed before payment was made, collapsed under the documentation that Alberta had preserved with the careful obstinacy of a woman who had known since February that she might need it. Jasper Holt, the county recorder, sat at a separate table and said nothing and looked at the floor, and afterward Commissioner Drummond had additional words with him privately, and whatever those words were, Holt looked considerably smaller when they were finished. Alberta walked out of the county office into the Lander afternoon with the ruling in her hand, and stood on the wooden walkway and breathed the air and felt something she identified, after a moment, as the specific relief of having been right, which was different from the relief of having won, and better. Nathan was beside her. He had ridden with her to Lander 4 hours each way, and he had sat beside her in the county office without speaking, because he understood that this was her matter and her victory, and his presence was support, not leadership, and she had been aware of that understanding the entire time. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She turned to look at him. "Thank you for Drummond for everything these past weeks. You had the paperwork," he said, "and the character. Drummond would have found in your favor regardless of my letter. Probably," she said, "but 10 days sooner mattered." He nodded. They walked to where their horses were tied, and Alberta folded the ruling carefully and put it inside her coat, close to her chest, and Nathan watched her do it with a look that was not quite a smile but had the same warmth. "I would like to have supper again," she said, without quite looking at him, "if that is still being offered." "It is always being offered," he said. And then, more quietly, "You are always welcome at my table, Alberta." She looked up at him. 4 hours back to Harlow Creek in the afternoon light, and 7 miles more to her own land, and something had shifted permanently in the arrangement of the world, and she found that she was glad. The summer deepened, and the heat settled on the high plain, and Alberta's wheat came up green and strong in the lower field, and her kitchen garden produced more tomatoes than she could eat alone, and she left the surplus on the porch of the general store with a note, and the town of Harlow Creek began slowly to revise its initial assessment of the Rourke woman. She was still called fierce. That word never entirely went away, but the flavor of it changed. Fierce in the sense of capable. Fierce in the sense of present. She went to supper at the Keating Ranch on Saturday evenings, and Nathan came to her place on Tuesday afternoons to help with whatever that week's large project was. He had suggested this arrangement with the same practical framing he used for most things, pointing out that some of the tasks on her property, stretching new fence wire across the north boundary, repairing the windmill, setting the new corner posts, were easier with two people, and she had agreed because it was true, and also because she was done pretending that the only reason she looked forward to his company was efficiency. They worked well together. That was something she had not expected from a romantic feeling, the particular ease of it, the way two people who were both competent could move through a task without negotiation, each reading what the other was doing and fitting into it naturally. He handed her tools before she asked. She anticipated where he was going with a repair and prepared the materials. They talked sometimes and were silent sometimes, and both were comfortable. It was a Tuesday in late July when he kissed her. They had just finished setting the last post on the north fence, and they were standing together looking out at the completed line, which ran straight and true across the boundary of her land, and she was feeling the particular satisfaction of a thing finally done right, and she turned to say something to him about it and found him closer than she had realized, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he raised one hand and touched her face, the back of his knuckles to her jaw, very gently, the same jaw that had been bruised when she arrived in Harlow Creek and was now healed and whole, and she went very still, and he kissed her with the same care he brought to everything, steady and unhurried, and she kissed him back with the same intensity she brought to everything, and it was not a gentle storm exactly, but it was real in the way that storms are real, uncompromising, and full of electricity. When they separated, he kept his hand against her jaw, and she had both of hers against his chest, and the fence they had built together stretched away behind them in the afternoon light. "I have been wanting to do that since the first afternoon at the creek," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You knew." "I suspected," she amended. "I wasn't sure you would do anything about it." "I wasn't sure you would want me to," he said. "I have been leaving you the door," she said, "since May approximately." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I am slower than some." "No," she said. "You are careful. There is a difference." She looked up at him. "I prefer careful." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did smile fully, the way he had the day of the calf, but larger now and without the self-consciousness, and she thought that she could build a whole life in the direction of that smile and not regret a single day of it. "Alberta," he said. "Nathan," she said. And that was the whole of that conversation, but it was enough. August burned through the high plain, and the cattle grew fat on the summer grass, and Alberta's wheat stood gold and heavy and ready for harvest. Nathan brought Ray and Hector and Willard to help with the cutting, and she worked beside them all day in the heat. And at the end of it, they sat on her porch in the last of the light, and drank cold water from the well, and the feeling in the air was one she recognized from her childhood as the feeling of a good day, honestly ended. Ray Dokes was 20 years old and had the open face of someone who had not yet decided what to do with the world, and he had been regarding Alberta with a mix of awe and nervousness since the June incident with Marden's men, when he had watched her hold her ground at the creek crossing with a calm that he clearly found superhuman. On the porch that evening he finally said, with the awkwardness of a young man trying to say something direct, "Miss Rourke, you are not at all what I expected from a woman running a place alone." "What did you expect?" she said. He thought about it. "More trouble," he said. "Like for the woman herself, I thought it would be harder." "It is hard," she said, "but hard and impossible are different things." He nodded slowly, thinking about that, and Willard Patch said from the end of the porch, "Son, the error most people make is they see a woman working harder than two men, and they think she's performing something unusual, when really she is just doing what is necessary." He glanced at Alberta, "Begging your pardon, Miss Rourke." "No pardon needed," she said. "That is exactly right." Nathan, sitting in the chair beside her, said nothing. He had been saying nothing for an hour, the easy quiet of a man who had no need to add to a conversation that was going well, and his shoulder was almost touching hers in the evening warmth. And when the others were not watching, he had turned his hand over on the arm of the chair so his palm was up, and she had laid her hand in his, and they had sat that way as the sun went down, in full view of nobody and in plain sight of everything. September came, and with September came the first cool nights, and the aspens on the north slopes going gold, and the river running swift and dark with fall rain. Alberta's wheat was harvested and stored, and she had enough from the summer's garden and the field to carry her through the winter with careful management, and she looked at her land with the satisfaction of a person who has reclaimed something real. She and Nathan had stopped being careful or quiet about their regard for each other, which in the context of Harlow Creek meant that Elbert Crane knew and Hector knew and Ray and Willard knew and half the town knew, and the other half suspected. And there was some talk, because there was always talk. There were women who said it was unusual, and men who said she was difficult, and a few people of both descriptions who said they had never seen Nathan Keating look like that, and found it an improvement. One afternoon in September, Alberta was in the general store when a woman named Cecily Hartman, the wife of the mill owner, said to another woman in a voice carefully pitched to Carrie, "I give it 6 months. He will find her impossible. Everyone does." Alberta did not stop moving through the store. She picked up the salt she had come for and set it on the counter and said, clearly and without hostility, to the room at large, "I have been called impossible by men who were looking for easy, and difficult by men who could not keep up, and too fierce by people who wanted the land without the work it requires." She set her coins on the counter and picked up the salt. "Nathan Keating is none of those things, which is why it will not be 6 months. It will be considerably longer." She looked at Cecily Hartman levelly. "Good afternoon." She walked out into the September sunshine and mounted Dust and Road, and it was not until she was well out of town that she allowed herself to feel the embarrassment of having said so much, which was immediately followed by the realization that she did not regret a single word of it. When she told Nathan that evening, sitting on her porch with the coffee he had brought from the ranch, Hector's recipe, strong and dark, he was quiet for a moment. "Considerably longer," he said. "I may have overcommitted," she said carefully. "No," he said. "You were exactly right." He set his coffee cup down on the porch rail and turned to face her properly, which he did when something was going to be important. "Alberta, I'm not going to dance around this. I have been thinking for 2 months about whether the timing is right, and I have concluded that timing is largely invented." She looked at him carefully. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "I am aware that you have managed this land alone and done it well, and do not require a husband for practical purposes. I am also aware that you are not someone who makes decisions out of convention. So I am asking because I want to share my life with you specifically, not because it is expected or because it is convenient, but because when I think about any version of my future that does not include you in it, I find it substantially less interesting than any version that does." The evening was very quiet around them. A nighthawk called somewhere in the dark above the field. "That is," she said after a moment, "probably the most direct proposal I have ever heard. Have there been others?" He said, and she saw the faintest tension in his jaw. "One," she said, "from a man in Cheyenne who spent 30 minutes explaining why it would benefit me and then looked confused when I declined." She paused. "Yours is better." "I'm glad to hear it," he said carefully. She looked at him. She looked at the field she had planted and harvested, the fence they had built together, the porch she had repaired, the house she had made livable out of wreckage. She looked at the man sitting beside her who had offered tools and lumber and time and honesty and the particular grace of knowing when to speak and when to be quiet. "Yes," she said. "My answer is yes." He let out a breath she had not realized he was holding, and then he did something she had not expected from him, which was reach across and take both of her hands in his and hold them like they were something worth keeping, which she supposed they were. He was not a man who made large gestures, but this one was large enough. "I want to be clear," she said, because she was incapable of not being clear, "that I will not be managing your house for you. I will be managing my land, which I intend to keep." "I would not have it any other way," he said, without any hesitation at all. "The Rourke land is yours. I have never thought of it differently." She looked at him. "You really are not complicated," she said. "I am very simple," he said with the ghost of that smile. "I have found something good and I intend to keep it." "Nathan," she said. "Yes." "Stop talking," she said, and kissed him, which he had no objection to whatsoever. They were married in November of 1882 in the small clapboard church at the edge of Harlow Creek, on a Saturday when the sky was the hard, cold blue of late autumn, and the ground was frosted, and the mountains to the north were white halfway down their sides. Hector cooked for the celebration afterward in the Keating Ranch kitchen. Ray Dokes wore a suit that was slightly too large for him and stood very straight, clearly taking the occasion seriously. Willard Patch sat in the front row of the church with the composed expression of a man who had waited long enough to see Nathan Keating find some happiness and was deeply relieved that it had finally happened. Alberta wore a dress she had made herself from dark blue wool, plain and well cut, and she did not carry flowers because she had never understood the point of carrying flowers, and she walked into the church alone, which raised a few eyebrows, and stood beside Nathan and met the minister's eyes without flinching, and said her vows in a clear, steady voice that did not tremble and meant every word. Nathan said his vows quietly and completely, as he did everything, looking at her the whole time, that full attention she had come to understand as the particular shape of his love, steady and total, and without qualification. When the minister pronounced them married and Nathan kissed her briefly with the whole congregation watching, she heard Hector make a sound from the second row that was unmistakably a suppressed sob of happiness, which she thought she would remember for the rest of her life. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was not gentle. Wyoming winters rarely were, but there was something different about facing it within a shared life. The Rourke land and the Keating Ranch were separate properties but adjacent, and Nathan and Alberta fell into a rhythm that accommodated both. She managed her land with the thoroughness she had always brought to it, and he managed his, and they met in the middle in the way that two people who trust each other can meet in the middle without losing either direction. He learned that she was up before dawn and needed quiet and coffee before she was entirely sociable, and he provided both without comment. She learned that he had bad nights sometimes, when the weight of the ranch and the memories of his father and the general cost of carrying everything alone for 5 years came due all at once. And on those nights, she did not try to fix it but simply stayed close and let him know that the carrying was not entirely his anymore, and that seemed to help. They argued occasionally. She was direct and he was careful, and sometimes those things caught on each other and produced friction, and the friction was real but never destructive, because they were both too honest to let it become something it wasn't, and they were both, at their cores, people who had chosen this and knew why they had chosen it. Spring came again, and with spring came news that Alberta had suspected for several weeks and confirmed in February with the help of the doctor who traveled through Harlow Creek quarterly. She told Nathan on a Tuesday evening on the porch of the Rourke house. She still kept her own house and stayed there when the work on her land required it, which Nathan understood and respected, and she told him plainly, as she told everything. "We are going to have a child," she said. "In September, I expect." He went very still in the way he went still when something was important. Then he turned to look at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, not just the full attention, but something underneath it that was almost overwhelming, something that had no composure in it at all. "Alberta," he said and stopped. "I know," she said, because she did. He reached over and took her hand and held it, and they sat with the spring evening coming on around them and the land stretching away in every direction, green and alive and enormous. And he pressed her hand between both of his and said nothing for a long time, and she let him have the silence because she understood it. "Are you well?" he finally said. "I am very well," she said. "I am stronger than I look, which is already saying something." This made him smile, and then the smile turned into something else, something that was not quite composed, and she realized with a kind of wonder that he was not going to be able to stop it. And she watched Nathan Keating, the quietest man she had ever known, put his face briefly in his hands and breathe, just breathe, with the feeling too large for his usual containment. She put her hand on his back and left it there. After a moment he lifted his head and looked out at the field. "I did not know," he said quietly, "that it was possible to want something this much and not have known you were waiting for it." "No," she said. "Neither did I," he looked at her. Is this something you want?" "It is the most surprising thing I have ever wanted," she said honestly. "And yes," he nodded. Then he did the thing she still was not entirely used to, which was smile completely, fully, without restraint, and it was, as it always was, worth everything. Summer in the Wyoming territory of 1883 was long and hot, and full of the ordinary drama of working land and raising cattle, and being married and expecting a child. Alberta refused to slow down more than was physically necessary, which was a source of mild ongoing debate. Nathan's position was that she should rest more. Her position was that the land did not rest and neither would she, and that she was pregnant, not injured. They met somewhere between these two positions, as they generally did, and the work got done and she stayed well, and he checked on her with the consistency of a man who had found the most important thing in his life, and was not willing to lose it. And she accepted this with more grace than she had expected she would, because she understood now that being cared for was not the same as being managed, and Nathan Keating had never in his life tried to manage her. In September of 1883, on a cold, clear morning when the aspens were just beginning to turn, Alberta gave birth to a son. He was a solid, loud, healthy boy with gray eyes that looked like his father's from the first day and a scowl that was, Nathan said, unmistakably hers. They named him James Robert Keating after Nathan's father and Alberta's, which seemed right. Hector brought a meal. Ray Doak stood in the yard and beamed with the uncomplicated happiness of a young man who has not yet had enough bad news to put a ceiling on his joy. Willard Patch, who had seen a great deal of life, sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and looked at the door through which the sounds of new life were audible and said quietly, to nobody in particular, that Nathan's father would have been pleased, and he meant it, and the room was quiet for a moment with the weight of that. Nathan sat beside Alberta in the bedroom of the Rourke house. They had moved here for the birth because she had refused to leave her own land, which was so Alberta that he had not argued, and he held James Robert Keating with the careful wonder of a man holding something precious, and looked at his wife with an expression that she thought might be the most open she had ever seen on a human face. "He is very loud," she said. "Yes," Nathan said. "I think he takes after you." She gave him a look. He smiled. "It is a compliment," he said. "He knows what he wants and he is not going to be quiet about it." "Heaven help you," she said, and lay back and was asleep within minutes because she was exhausted, and he sat with the boy and the lamplight and the quiet of the house on the land that she had reclaimed and he had helped her keep, and he thought about the shape of his life and found it larger and better and more complete than anything he had had the imagination to plan. The years that followed in Harlow Creek were neither simple nor without struggle, because that was the nature of the Wyoming territory and the nature of life, and neither Alberta nor Nathan Keating was the kind of person who expected things to be simple, which made the struggles survivable. There were hard winters and dry summers and seasons when the cattle market dropped and seasons when it rose. There were years when the Rourke land produced abundantly and years when the harvest was modest and careful planning mattered. There were the ordinary difficulties of two strong-willed people making a life together, and the ordinary graces too, the ones that accumulate quietly over shared years. The coffee in the morning, the hand in the dark, the particular shorthand of two people who have learned each other's silences. James grew from a loud, scowling, opinionated baby into a loud, determined, opinionated boy who had his mother's directness and his father's patience, and a fascination with horses that began the day Hector put him on a gentle mare at age 3 and never diminished. He was followed in 1886 by a daughter named Eleanor, who arrived with the same healthy certainty as her brother and grew into a child who was thoughtful and observant in the way of her father, and would periodically make observations at the supper table that brought the whole room to surprised silence. By 1887, the Rourke land was fully productive wheat and a kitchen garden, and a small but healthy herd of cattle that Alberta had built from scratch with the same methodical determination she brought to everything. She had formalized a grazing arrangement with Nathan's ranch that benefited both properties. She had also, over the previous 5 years, become something that she had not expected to become in Harlow Creek, a person people came to for advice. Not because she had sought it, but because she was known as someone who spoke the truth without varnish, and had demonstrated repeatedly that the truth without varnish was more useful than comfort with lies. Women came to her, sometimes women in the situation she understood well, women who were managing things alone or were being managed too completely, women who needed to see that it was possible to be fierce and to be loved, and for those two things not to be in contradiction. She had not set out to be any kind of example. She was simply being Alberta Rourke, who was now Alberta Keating in the eyes of the county records but remained, in the ways that mattered, entirely herself. She thought about this on a June evening in 1887, sitting on the porch of the Rourke house while the children played in the yard. James was 4 and loud, and Eleanor was a year old and crawling with fierce intent toward anything she was not supposed to touch, and Nathan sat in the chair beside her with his coffee and the particular quiet that meant he was content. "That woman from the Haverson claim came to see me today," she said. "Mrs. Haverson. Her husband has been spending money they don't have on liquor in town and refusing to account for it." "What did you tell her?" he said. "I told her what her options were," Alberta said, "and that having them was the first step. I also told her that Elbert Crane will give her credit on her own account if she asks, separate from her husband's, and that she has the legal right to manage her own affairs if she chooses to do so." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Does she know what she wants to do?" "Not yet," Alberta said, "but she knows she has choices now. That is different from where she was this morning." He nodded. In the yard, James had found a stick of substantial interest and Eleanor had achieved her target object, which was a feed bucket, and was examining it with the gravity of a scientist. The evening was warm and smelled of grass and the distant rain that was building over the mountains. "You are good at that," Nathan said. "At what?" "At seeing what someone actually needs and giving them the part of it you can give without making it about you." He paused. "It is not a common quality." She glanced at him. "You do the same thing," she said. "I am not nearly as good at it," he said. "I spent most of my life giving people the quiet instead of the words. You give them the words and make them better for it." She was quiet for a moment. "I was always told the words were the problem," she said. "The words are the best of it," he said. "The precision of you, the refusal to be vague." He looked at her. "I have never once wished you were different." She looked at him. It was a plain statement, said plainly, and she believed it because every day of the 5 years they had been married had supported it. Every time he had let her say the difficult thing and followed her into it rather than asking her to pull back. Every time he had told her she was right when she was right and said so honestly when he disagreed. Every time he had looked at her with that full attention and meant it. "I know," she said. Eleanor made a sound of triumph from the yard. James had found a second stick, and was conducting some sort of negotiation with the fence post. The rain was coming, still far away but building, and the light was the deep gold of a Wyoming evening in June. And she had this land and this house and these children and this man beside her, and she was here, entirely present and entirely herself, and she was loved. She reached over and put her hand on his, and he turned his palm and held her hand, and they sat in the evening quiet and watched their children in the yard. In the spring of 1888, Hector retired from the Keating ranch. He was not young. He had never told anyone his exact age, which he maintained was his own business. And he had decided, he announced, that he was going to visit his sister in Santa Fe, and then he was going to see what else occurred to him, and he was going to do it without any cows telling him what time to wake up. There was a supper in his honor that ran until late into the night and involved Hector himself cooking, because he did not trust anyone else with his own farewell meal, which was deeply characteristic and made everyone laugh. Nathan hired a young woman named Doris Beckett as the new cook and general housekeeper for the ranch, which was unusual, and which he had done because she had come to him asking for work and was competent and needed it, and which was exactly the kind of decision that made Alberta look at him and think, again and always, that she had chosen well. Ray Dokes had, by this time, become a genuinely skilled cattleman, and was effectively Nathan's second in command, having grown in the intervening years from a too-young cowboy who didn't know how to be in the world into a steady, capable young man of 26 who had learned, largely by watching the Keatings, that competence and decency were not mutually exclusive. One day that same spring, Ray came to the Rourke house looking for Alberta with his hat in his hands and the expression of a young man who has something important to say and is not sure how to start. "Mrs. Keating," he said. "Ray," she said, "sit down, there's coffee." He sat. He held his hat. He drank the coffee she handed him and then said, "I've been thinking about something and I thought you might, you have a way of seeing things clear and I don't know who else to ask." "Ask," she said. "There's a woman," he said, "Kathleen Morse. Her father has the sheep operation north of Lander. He stopped. I've been going to see her regular for 4 months. I'd like to ask her to marry me, but I don't know if I have the right to, given that I'm just a ranch hand and her father is a man of some property." Alberta looked at him calmly. "Do you love her?" she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said without hesitation. "Does she love you?" He thought about this carefully, which she respected. "I believe so," he said. "She has said as much." "Then your question is not whether you have the right," Alberta said. "Your question is whether you have the courage. The right you have. 2 people who love each other and are willing to work for it have the right." She set her coffee down. "As for the courage, you held your ground at the North Fork crossing in the summer of 1882 against 3 men twice your age, and you did not flinch. You have the courage. You are simply afraid of a different kind of ground." Ray was quiet for a moment, and then he nodded slowly and something settled in his face. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Go ask her," Alberta said, "before the spring is over and you've spent another season second-guessing yourself." He went. He asked. Kathleen Morse said yes. The wedding was in July, and Alberta went with Nathan and the children and sat in the 3rd row and watched Ray Dokes, her neighbor's hand, the 20-year-old boy who had been too nervous to speak to her at supper in 1882, become a husband, and thought about the way good things propagated outward when you planted them correctly. The summer of 1888 was also when Alberta took on what Harlow Creek came to call the Schoolhouse Project, though Alberta herself would have called it a practical response to a real problem. The town's schoolhouse had burned in May, a lamp left untended, and the county was slow to provide funds for rebuilding, and the children of the town were missing their schooling, and Alberta had simply had enough of waiting and had organized the rebuilding herself. She had solicited materials from every ranch and homestead within 20 miles, organized the labor with the precision of a military campaign, and had the frame of a new schoolhouse up within 3 weeks, the building completed in 6, and a letter sent to the county commissioner in Lander, pointing out that the funds originally allocated could now be directed to furnishings, a teacher's salary, and books, since the structure had been handled by the community. The letter to the county commissioner was signed Alberta Keating, and it was, by all accounts, extremely direct, and it worked. The commissioner, who had met Alberta once at Commissioner Drummond's visit in 1882 and had not forgotten the occasion, allocated the funds without further debate. Nathan, when he heard the full account from Ray, who had heard it from Willard Patch, who had been present for most of it, said simply, "Of course she did," and went back to what he was doing, and the affection in those 3 words was enough to fill the whole room. In the autumn of 1889, Wyoming became a state, and with statehood came changes in the territory's legal structure that had real implications for property rights and water rights. And Alberta spent several evenings that fall carefully reviewing the new statutes with the same attention she had brought to her original deed in 1882, making sure that nothing slipped through the new arrangements that might threaten what she had built. Nathan sat with her on several of these evenings, reading alongside her, asking useful questions. James, who was 6 and had an early aptitude for sitting still and listening when something interested him, periodically appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt and was sent back to bed, and reappeared 20 minutes later and was sent back again. And the third time Alberta simply made space at the table and let him sit there, because he was clearly going to stay awake regardless, and she had her mother's practicality about which battles to fight. "What is that?" James asked, pointing at the document. "It is the law," Alberta said. "What law?" "The new state law about who owns what and who has the right to water." He thought about this seriously. "Do we have the right to the water?" "Yes," she said. "We fought for it and we kept it and the law says so." He nodded, processing this. "Did you fight somebody?" he asked with the intense interest of a 6-year-old for any story involving fighting. "I fought with documents," she said. He considered this. "Was that as good as fighting with guns?" "Better," she said. "More permanent." He seemed uncertain about this but willing to accept it from her. And Nathan, on the other side of the table, had the precise expression of a man who is successfully not smiling only through significant effort. And Alberta caught his eye, and he lost the battle briefly and looked down at his papers, and she looked back at hers. And James sat between them in his nightshirt, and worked through this new information about the relative value of documents versus guns, with the thoroughness that she recognized as entirely her own, and which she found, in this context, wonderful. By 1890, the Rourke land and the Keating ranch together constituted one of the more solid operations in that part of Wyoming. They were not the largest. There were cattle barons in the territory who dwarfed any individual ranch of this size, but they were sound, and they were honest, and they were known for both. Nathan had expanded his herd carefully over the years and had made some selective breeding decisions that were producing cattle with better conformation and therefore better market prices. Alberta had diversified her wheat production and had added a small apple orchard on the south slope that was just beginning to produce in real quantities, a project that required the patience of a person willing to plant things she might not see fully bear fruit for years, which she found entirely compatible with her nature. Eleanor, at 4, had begun to express opinions about everything, which her father found deeply familiar and which resulted in supper-table conversations that were occasionally argumentative and always interesting. James had developed a specific obsession with the horses on the ranch and spent every available hour in the barn, which Willard Patch, still on the ranch, still steady, into his 60s now but showing no signs of slowing, encouraged by teaching him everything he knew, which was considerable. Alberta watched her children growing up on this land that she had reclaimed from ruin, and she thought sometimes about the woman who had ridden in from Cheyenne 3 years before with $2.40 and a deed and a rifle, and the kind of determination that had nowhere else to go. She had known, even then, that the land required fierceness. She had not known, could not have known, all the other things that would be required of her, and all the other things the land and this life and this man would return. She was 34 years old in 1890, and she was stronger than she had been at 26, not just in the way of muscle and endurance, though those too, but in the way of understanding. She knew the land and the law and her neighbors and herself, and she knew the man beside her, and knowing things deeply was the only kind of richness she had ever sought. One evening that October, with the aspens blazing and the air sharp and clean, and the first early snow dusting the northern peaks, she and Nathan rode the boundary fence of her property together, just the two of them, the horses moving at an easy walk and their breath making small clouds in the autumn air. It was something they did periodically, not always for practical reasons, sometimes simply to move through the land together and see what it was doing. They came to the section of fence along the North Fork, the stretch they had built together 8 years ago, and it was still standing straight and true because they had built it right, and she stopped just beside it and looked at the creek running dark and cold below. "Do you remember the first time I spoke to you?" she said. "You asked me if I had formal claim on your water," he said, "and told me you preferred not to fight if there were other options. And you said you had never drawn from the section on my land." "The truth had the virtue of being convenient," he said. She glanced at him. "Was it convenient?" she said. "Or was it just true?" He considered. "Both," he said. "I had no claim, and I was glad of it because I wanted to be useful to you and not in opposition." "You wanted to be useful to me," she repeated. "On the first afternoon." "On the first afternoon," he confirmed. He looked at the creek. "You were remarkable." "I was calculating water rights," she said. "Yes," he said, "it was remarkable." She was quiet for a moment, and then she laughed, a real laugh, full and genuine, the way she laughed when she was entirely off guard and entirely happy. And the sound of it went out over the land she had built and kept, and the creek she had fought for, and the fence they had built together. And it was, in the way of that particular autumn evening on that particular piece of the Wyoming high plain, exactly right. He was looking at her the way he had always looked at her, with the full attention that she understood now as the specific shape of his love. And she looked back at him, and the land spread out around them in all directions, gold and vast and fierce and beautiful. "I want to show you something," she said, and turned dust and rode south across the property toward the orchard, where the apple trees were heavy with their second real harvest, the fruit dark red against the gold afternoon light, and the air around them was sweet with it. And she stopped, and he stopped beside her, and they looked at the trees. "I planted these 4 years ago," she said, "when the second year of waiting with nothing to show felt like it might be the condition permanently. And now," he said, "and now they produce more than we can eat, and I have been selling the surplus in town and using the money for James's books," she said, "because he will want books, that one." "Will want a great many things," Nathan said. "He is your son," she smiled, looking at the trees. "And yours," she said. "He has your patience underneath the wanting. He will figure out how to get the things he goes after." Nathan reached over on his horse and put his hand briefly at her back between her shoulder blades just for a moment, the way he had touched her 1,000 times, not possessively, not performatively, just present, just saying, "I am here, and here is good." "I love you," she said. She had been saying it for years now, easily, because it was true, and she saw no reason to treat the truth as something requiring elaborate ceremony. But she said it now with a particular weight, in the orchard she had planted and tended through the uncertain years, because it seemed like the right place to say it again. "I love you," he said, the same weight, the same truth. They rode back to the house as the light left the orchard, and the evening came down blue and cold and clear, and Alina ran out to meet them, shouting something about a mouse she had found in the barn, and James was right behind her arguing about the proper policy regarding barn mice, and the horses nickered, and the smoke was rising from the chimney of the house that Alberta had built back from ruin, and it was everything, all of it, the full and sufficient everything of a life honestly lived and fiercely kept. Winter came in earnest in 1890, and brought with it the deep cold that settled on the Wyoming high plain and made the world small and white and inward. The family spent the long evenings in the main room of the Rourke house, which Alberta had expanded in the summer of 1886 to accommodate the life. It now contained a larger kitchen, a proper sitting room, two additional bedrooms that the children had grown into and made fully their own. Nathan read to the children from the books that James had accumulated with the avidity of a small scholar. Alberta mended and organized and planned, always planned, the next season's work laid out in her mind, even in the depths of the cold, because the planning was part of the pleasure. There were evenings when the children were in bed, and the house was quiet and the fire was low, and she and Nathan sat across from each other in the sitting room and simply existed in the same space without needing to fill it. And these were the evenings she thought of later when she thought about what love was. Not the dramatic moments, though those were real, but the accumulated weight of all the ordinary evenings, the specific peace of being exactly where you were supposed to be with exactly the right person. The world outside cold and vast and fierce, the space inside warm and sufficient. He was, she had concluded over the years, the best person she knew. Not because he was without flaws. He had the flaws of a man who had carried things alone for too long before she arrived, and sometimes still retreated into the carrying, before he remembered he didn't have to. But because he was entirely honest about who he was and what he wanted and what he valued, and she had never once doubted any of it. And doubting very little about a person you loved was a condition that she had come to understand was not common and not small. In the spring of 1891, Willard Patch, who had turned 68 and acknowledged that his joints were making their opinions known, retired with ceremony and the deep, genuine respect of everyone on both properties. They settled him in a small house on the Keating land near the river, which Nathan had built for him over the previous winter, and which Willard accepted with the simplicity of a man who knew the difference between charity and a debt well honored. He spent his days fishing and occasionally dispensing wisdom to James, who had taken to spending time with him in the way that young people with good instincts sometimes take to old people who know things worth knowing. Ray Dokes took over the full management of the Keating Ranch day-to-day operations, and did it well. He and Kathleen had a daughter, and then, in 1891, a son, and they lived on the eastern edge of the Keating land in the house that Ray had built over 2 summers with help from Nathan and the hands, and they had the particular happiness of people who had found each other without too much drama and were grateful for it. Alberta's 40th year, 1896, 14 years after she had ridden into Harlow Creek with $2.40 and a rifle across her saddle, was marked by the school board of Harlow Creek asking her to sit on it, which she did, and by the completion of a new well on the south side of the Rourke property, which she and Nathan dug together over 3 weeks with occasional help from James, who was now 13 and as tall as his mother and doing everything he could to be as useful as possible, which she encouraged and Nathan supervised with the calm consistency of a man who understood that a boy becoming a man needed work more than it needed instruction. Eleanor at 10 had her father's eyes and her mother's absolute precision of thought, and had recently informed her parents that she intended to be a doctor. This announcement had been made at the supper table with the clarity of a constitutional proclamation. There was a pause. That would require considerable schooling, Nathan said. Yes, Eleanor said, I know. Beyond what Harlow Creek can provide, Alberta said. I know that too, Eleanor said. I am making a plan. Alberta looked at her daughter across the table and felt something enormous and specific in her chest, which was the feeling of seeing yourself in someone else, and knowing that what you were seeing was going to be fine, more than fine, was going to go further than you had gone and carry everything forward. Tell us the plan, Alberta said. And Eleanor told them the plan, detailed and practical and ambitious and entirely possible, and Nathan listened and asked useful questions, and Alberta amended 2 points and affirmed the rest, and James ate steadily and said, She is going to do it, with the authority of a brother who understood his sister, and none of them doubted him. The following spring, 1897, Alberta Keating stood at the north fence line of the Rourke land on a morning in April when the world was beginning again, the grass greening, the creek running loud with snowmelt, the sky the particular washed blue of early spring, and looked at the 40 acres she had reclaimed from nothing, and the cattle in the lower field, and the orchard coming into blossom on the south slope, and the house that she had rebuilt with her own hands and filled with her own life. Nathan came to stand beside her. He had ridden over from the ranch for the morning, and he smelled of horses and coffee and the outdoors, and he stood close enough that their shoulders touched, and they looked at the land together. 15 years, she said. Very nearly, he said. She thought about the woman on the road into town in 1882, the one who had been told all her life that fierceness and love could not coexist, that the qualities that made her capable of claiming this land were the same qualities that made her impossible to love. She thought about what she would say to that woman if she could. She thought she would say, "The right person will not ask you to be less fierce. The right person will understand that fierce is what this land requires, and that the land and the love are not separate things. They are the same thing, the same will toward life, the same refusal to let the good things go." She did not say any of this to Nathan because he already knew it. He had told her as much in his own way 100 times over 15 years, in every practical offer and shared task and quiet evening and steady look. "James wants to go to Laramie next fall," she said. "The agricultural college." "I know," Nathan said. "He told me. He wants to study land management and animal science." "He wants to come back," she said. "He said as much. He wants to come back and run this." "Both properties," Nathan said. "Yes," she said. "He will do it well," Nathan said. "He will do it his own way," she said, "which will be different from ours." "Good," Nathan said. And he meant it, she knew, because he was a man who understood that good things carried forward and grew and did not need to remain unchanged in order to remain good. She turned to look at him. He was 46 years old, and the years had given him lines at the corners of his eyes and silver at his temples, and a quality of settledness that was different from the careful restraint she had first encountered. This was genuine peace, the peace of a man who knew where he was and wanted to be there. She thought he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and she thought it without embarrassment, because she was past embarrassment about the things she loved. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That I am glad I came back," she said, "to this land in 1882. "So am I," he said, "and that you were exactly right," she said. "About what? Timing is largely invented." He looked at her for a moment, and then he smiled slowly, the full smile. And she had been receiving that smile for 15 years, and it still changed something in the air around her, still felt like a window opening in a stone wall and all the warmth of the interior coming through. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood at the fence line of her land in the April morning with the creek running cold and bright below them and the world beginning all around them. And it was solid and true and entirely sufficient, and it was theirs. There was nothing fierce about the peace they had earned. Or perhaps that was the thing she had always understood, even when she was too young to have the words for it. Perhaps peace, real peace, the kind you build from wreckage with your own hands and keep through effort and choice every day of your life, was the fiercest thing of all. She had been called too fierce to love. She had loved fiercely, and been loved fiercely in return, and built something that stood against the Wyoming sky in the spring light, solid as the fence posts they had set together, solid as the house she had rebuilt beam by beam, solid as the creek running on its course through land that was hers and had always been hers, and would carry her name forward in the mouths of her children and her children's children for as long as the high plain lasted, which she intended to be a very long time. Nathan pressed a kiss to her temple, brief and sure, the way he did everything. "Come on," he said. "The cattle won't move themselves." "They certainly won't," she agreed. And they walked back from the fence line together in the April morning, shoulder to shoulder, unhurried into the work and the life and the love they had built on this fierce, generous, demanding, beautiful land.